I said step away from the truck, the HOA enforcer barked, one hand resting on the tow truck's fender, the other hovering near the holster, clipped to his belt like this was some kind of battlefield. I didn't move. This is my ranch, my land, and my damn truck. The second tow chain clinked against the asphalt, the driver hesitating as I stood between them and the battered 1984 Ford parked neatly outside my barn. That truck wasn't just metal and tires, it had been my father's. Before the stroke, hauled hay, cattle, and 30 years of sweat and memories. But that didn't matter to the HOA, not since they decided I didn't fit the image they were selling to out-of-town buyers. The enforcer, Kyle Denning, same guy who handed me a $600 fine last month for painting my barn door red instead of earth-tone beige, flashed a clipboard. You were warned about violations, Mr. Nash. That vehicle's an eyesore. It hasn't moved in weeks. I spat into the gravel, and yet it's licensed, insured, and I used it yesterday to haul fencing. He didn't care. His lips curled into that same condescending smirk I'd seen at the last community meeting, right before they voted to limit livestock to decorative breeds only. He was their star boy, a failed real estate agent who wormed into HOA leadership and started enforcing rules like he was running a prison camp instead of a ranch community. And he hated that I didn't kiss his ring like the rest of them. You've got 30 seconds to move or we impound it. And that's when I decided I wasn't just going to stop them. I was going to flip the whole damn power game they thought they were winning. What Kyle didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the little office they used as headquarters, the one built illegally on my land 15 years ago, back when property lines were still being sorted by handshake and coffee-stained maps, I had proof, signed, notarized proof, that it belonged to me. And after years of their fines, threats, and thinly veiled profiling, I was done playing by their rules. So I told him, tow my truck, and I'll tow your damn office. Straight into the pines. He laughed. You try that, and you'll be in jail by sundown. But I already had the backhoe running before he could blink dot in the distance. The metal groaned as I dragged the HOA's prefab building fax machine, filing cabinets, and all off its shaky foundation and toward the tree line. And for the first time in a long time, Kyle shut up, because this wasn't just about a truck. It was about a war they started long before today, when they stopped seeing me as a neighbor and started seeing me as a problem. This was about the letter they sent saying my niece couldn't stay with me because she lowered the community profile. About the way they watched every move I made like I was trespassing on my own bloodline. And it was about to get worse for them because that land deed I held. It had the coordinates of the HOA building outlined in red ink. I'd held on to it for a moment like this, and once the sheriff saw it, once the local paper ran the headline, that the HOA's own office was built illegally on private property. Every rule they used to harass me would fall apart. But I didn't need to explain all that to Kyle. Right now, he already looked like he knew he'd messed with the wrong rancher. The pattern hadn't started with the truck. Months before that, a series of formal warnings began showing up in my mailbox, each more specific than the last. The first claimed a violation due to a non-compliant mailbox color. The second, an unauthorized tool shed installed without HOA review. Then came the fine for exceeding grass height, though every neighbor around me had taller pasture. When I asked for clarification, I received automated responses with no names, no signatures, and no appeals process. Soon after, I was handed a $300 citation for hosting a family gathering that obstructed community tranquility. It was a barbecue, 8 people total. Every instance followed the same pattern. Anyone who wasn't part of the suburban transplant clique or hadn't voted in the most recent HOA election found themselves flagged. A retiree veteran down the road was fined for keeping chickens. Another family received repeated notices for unauthorized parking when their adult son visited on weekends. In meetings, the leadership explained it away as enforcing the standards, but the standards seemed to evolve whenever it suited them. The new HOA board had taken full control of all voting rights after rewriting the community charter with barely any notice. Meetings were no longer held at the local town hall, but at their prefabricated office, constructed quietly near the entrance of the community and guarded by selective security patrols. It became clear the board wasn't just enforcing community cohesion, it was pushing an image. That image didn't include aging trucks, livestock, or working-class residents. It didn't include anyone who challenged the appearance of a curated lifestyle designed for short-term rentals, property flipping, and golf cart parades. It especially didn't include anyone like me. I'd originally helped establish the neighborhood's zoning years ago when the first roads were graded and ranch lots parceled out. I owned one of the original 10-acre properties long before the housing boom pushed urban developers into our valley. That didn't stop the HOA from sending out land use policy memos claiming they had jurisdiction over easements and water rights. When I called the county to verify, they had no record of those policies. The HOA was inventing them. The final trigger before the truck incident was the letter they sent regarding my niece. She had been living with me for 6 months while attending community college. No complaints, no issues, stating she was not approved to live on site without board approval. According to their rewritten guidelines, only immediate family members of the primary homeowner could reside on the property without submitting to an application process that included interviews and background checks. The implication was clear. I submitted the documents proving legal guardianship. They responded with a second notice, adding a penalty fee for non-cooperation. It was never about policy, it was about pressure. They had targeted others before. Me, using bylaws as weapons and assuming no one would push back, most residents caved or moved. I didn't. While they escalated harassment, I started keeping records. I documented every notice. I cross-referenced each fine against public HOA guidelines. Most citations lacked code references or failed to meet the required notification time. I visited neighbors and asked questions. Several of them had stories similar to mine. A widower fined for the color of his garage door. A local firefighter told to remove an unregistered trailer he used for emergency equipment. They were systematic, targeted, and deliberate. But what they didn't realize was that I had history on my side. When the community was founded, the county had issued provisional plats for infrastructure and private road access. That same paperwork held boundary markers and utility easements. 15 years ago, the then board president asked permission to build a shared office space for admin functions. The paperwork was never completed. No purchase, no lease. I never signed off. And while most people forgot, I didn't. I had a physical copy of the original plat and a notarized letter from the original surveyor. I had let it slide, assuming good faith. That mistake ended the moment they targeted my family. Kyle Denning wasn't part of the original board. He moved in 3 years ago, began lobbying for beautification standards, and manipulated community votes to expand HOA authority. He wasn't a rancher. He wasn't even local. He had once been a real estate broker in Phoenix who lost his license over misrepresentation. He used charm and networking to get into leadership. He used bureaucracy to push out dissenters. When I showed up to the last open meeting, I was given a guest badge, despite being a property owner. I requested to speak. They closed the floor. I sent a letter. They said it lacked proper formatting. The goal wasn't dialogue. The goal was submission. And I had none left to give. So while they watched my truck, I watched their paperwork. I contacted a land attorney who confirmed the boundaries using drone imaging and tax records. Their office sat 23 feet into my property line. The foundation was unsecured. The structure uninspected. They had poured concrete and installed plumbing using HOA funds under the assumption that no one would ever challenge them until now. Every day I passed that building. I knew if I acted without proof, they'd spin it. But if I had the right timing, the right records, and the right eyes watching, I could do what none of their threats or votes could stop. So when they touched the truck, they crossed into a play I'd already scripted. I had a crew on standby. I had cameras rolling, and once I dropped their precious office in the woods, out of sight and off-grid. The message would be simple. If they wanted to play property games, I could too, accept mine were legal, documented, and 15 years overdue. They wanted compliance. What they got was consequences. The consequences became personal when they targeted her. She had nothing to do with HOA politics, no interest in community meetings or rural disputes. She was here to finish her degree quietly, away from the city. Her name wasn't on any deed. Her face wasn't known to the board. And yet the letters started coming under my name, citing her as a resident requiring review. The justification used was a newly inserted clause under non-immediate dependence, though no such category existed in prior guidelines. The review wasn't optional. It required a submission of her employment records, education documents, and a personal statement explaining her residency. The same documents the board had never requested from actual tenants running Airbnb rentals out of nearby homes. I requested the clause's source. The board said it was passed in a closed meeting, citing community integrity. They flagged her vehicle next, placing a violation sticker on the windshield for unregistered guest parking. It was parked in my driveway. I removed the sticker. The next morning, she found another. Later, a board member walked onto my property and took photos of the license plate. When confronted, the explanation was vague suspicious vehicle surveillance. I filed a privacy complaint. It was denied within 12 hours with no review notes. She stopped attending classes in person. The campus was 15 miles out, and the stress of driving back each evening, only to wonder if her presence would provoke more harassment, was interfering with her focus. They hadn't said anything directly to her, but it was the silence that built the wait letters, stickers, stares from HOA patrol cars that drove past slower than normal when she was outside. I contacted the community ombudsman. He forwarded the complaint back to the board, citing internal jurisdiction. I appealed to the county housing office. They responded with a form letter explaining that HOA policy enforcement was considered a private matter unless it involved health or safety. I submitted records showing that no other homeowners with visiting family members had received similar notices. That was ignored. The profiling became unmistakable when another homeowner, retired couple housing their grandson, was caught violating the exact same residency clause. No letters were sent, no vehicle stickers, no photos. That family had donated to the HOA's last landscaping initiative and had attended the last gala. She didn't. She worked part-time at a mechanic's shop, wore boots instead of flats, and hadn't grown up in a community run by property committees. The next incident was the fabricated noise complaint. A letter arrived claiming her presence correlated with multiple resident reports of disturbances. I asked for dates, names, recordings. The reply offered nothing. No evidence, no follow-up. Just an invoice for $150 processing fee and a warning that repeated infractions could result in a residency ban. No legal grounds, no precedent, no path to appeal. We documented everything. Photos of the truck without noise. Screenshots of her work shifts. Witness statements from neighbors who'd heard nothing. It didn't matter. The point wasn't to win a case. The point was to exhaust, to intimidate, to drive us out without direct confrontation. A week later, an email from the board arrived titled Unauthorized Alteration. Attached were 2 pictures of a folding chair and a garden hose. The caption said the items violated outdoor decor standards. The hose was rolled. The chair was next to a shed. Both were used by her when studying outside. The incident that shifted everything came 2 days later. She left the house and returned to find her car moved 5 feet from where it had been parked. A tow strap lay on the gravel. No one saw who moved it, and the security cameras covering the HOA office weren't pointed that direction. When I asked to see footage, the board claimed it had already been overwritten. She wanted to leave. The pressure, the targeting, the fear of confrontation, it reached the point where staying on the ranch felt like provocation. But I told her we weren't leaving. If she left, they won. And I hadn't collected 2 binders of violations, timelines, and double standards just to walk away without exposing them. We compiled a profile on similar victims. 5 other residents had reported vehicle citations without due process. 3 had filed complaints for harassment but were ignored. 1 family had sold their property at a loss after 3 months of repeated citations, inspections, and unannounced wellness checks under the guise of community safety. I reached out to an investigative property rights group. They reviewed the documents and confirmed the pattern matched. Several known cases where HOA leadership leveraged vague clauses to eliminate unwanted residents. Their legal team said this specific model targeting unrelated family, citing fabricated complaints and isolating individuals with repeat notices, was part of a playbook used in gentrifying rural communities. The group offered to help us draft a formal report, but the most important section was the comparative analysis, showing how others in similar scenarios were left untouched. It removed the argument of misunderstanding. The selective enforcement wasn't procedural, it was deliberate. I had her write a statement for the report, just a single page describing what she'd experienced, no emotion, just facts. She listed dates, incidents, and the actions that followed. When the advocacy group read it, they offered to elevate the case, not through legal battle, but exposure. They had connections in local media. I approved the release, but I didn't tell the board. Instead, I waited, because when the story broke, highlighting selective enforcement, intimidation tactics, and illegal residency standards, the board would issue its usual statement about misunderstanding. And when that didn't work, they'd try to pivot, blame, isolate Kyle, or issue rule revisions. But it would be too late, because by then, the HOA's building would already be sitting in the forest. Their response wouldn't just be against a homeowner, they'd be explaining to the entire community why they harassed a student, violated their own policies, and ignored their own borders. I wasn't just fighting for her right to stay. I was making sure they remembered why they should never have tried to erase her in the first place. The first attempt at resolution was a formal letter delivered by hand, not email, signed and time-stamped, addressed directly to the HOA board. It outlined the pattern of selective enforcement, included dated violations compared to identical unpenalized actions by other residents, and demanded an official meeting for review. No response was received within the 10-day period outlined in the community charter. A follow-up letter was submitted with a second copy sent by certified mail. Again, no reply. I attended the next HOA public meeting as a registered property owner. My presence required no approval. I requested to speak during the scheduled open floor period. My name was skipped during roll call. I raised the matter verbally. The HOA president stated the agenda was full. I reminded them of the bylaws. Regarding member questions, the microphone was cut and the board moved to the next item. A petition was started the following week. 7 residents signed within 2 days. Most expressed concern but feared retaliation, to withdraw signatures after receiving new violation notices regarding non-compliant trash bins and yard lighting. The remaining 5 were included in the final packet sent to the HOA office alongside a newly notarized summary of residency rights under county housing policy. The board issued an automated response from a generic email account 3 days later. The response included a general statement about community cohesion, denied any personal targeting, and asserted their actions were consistent with HOA expectations. The letter was unsigned. I requested an arbitration hearing. The bylaw stated that members could request an independent review of enforcement if 7 or more households supported the complaint. We had 5. The 6th had initially agreed, but refused after a board member visited their property for an informal inspection and warned them of possible landscaping violations. A private mediator was then hired. The request for a meeting was sent to the HOA office with all associated documents, including evidence of intimidation against the 6th household. The board declined to participate, citing internal handling procedures. The mediator's report was archived for later use. Evidence was shared with the county property assessor's office next. The documents included records of the HOA office's location, boundary lines, and the construction approval process or lack thereof. The county responded that, while they did not regulate HOA actions, any structure on improperly recorded land could be flagged for review. A case number was opened. A separate records request was filed at the building department. No permits existed under the HOA's name for the office's plumbing, wiring, or structural additions. 2 neighboring structures owned by residents unaffiliated with the board had received fines the previous year for minor unpermitted improvements. The office had not. The next HOA meeting was closed to the public without explanation. HOA patrol cars began passing more frequently. A new sign appeared near the HOA office, indicating restricted access. An email from the board was sent to all residents stating that disruptive behavior toward board members would result in fines and potential suspension of privileges. I responded by requesting all prior meeting minutes for the last 2 years. The HOA declined, citing internal policy. I submitted a secondary request under the charter clause that required transparency of board activities. No reply was issued. A violation letter was delivered to my property the following day, claiming improper storage of agricultural equipment. I sent a public notice to all HOA residents. It included a copy of the original property map, images of the HOA office in relation to recorded boundary markers, and an annotated comparison of citations issued to different residents over the previous 6 months. The document was uploaded to a public folder and distributed with a link. Downloads spiked within hours. The content was picked up by a regional blog focused on rural zoning disputes. An article was drafted within 24 hours. It was titled, "The HOA Built Its Office on the Wrong Property, Then Started Finding the Owner." The board issued a mass email in response stating that the article was based on misinformation and referred to a future statement from their legal team. No clarification or counter-evidence was provided. The county building inspector made a site visit 2 days later. A temporary notice was placed on the door of the HOA office stating that structure validation was pending. No HOA members were present during the inspection. The board held an emergency meeting that evening, close to residents again. I submitted a new demand for independent review based on the county's intervention. The HOA's attorney responded by email stating that no action had been taken, in violation of existing rules, and that all operations would continue as normal. I contacted a former board member who had resigned the previous year. They confirmed that the HOA had bypassed approval procedures by claiming the office sat on common ground land that was. A new packet was delivered to the HOA's registered address, county documents showing the land ownership, building department records showing the lack of permits, copies of all denied requests and evidence of pattern enforcement, surveyor's map confirming the structure's encroachment, witness statements from 5 residents who experienced retaliation, press coverage, screenshots, the land deed with original markers. The packet was not acknowledged. At this point, no further requests were sent. The waiting phase began. All future moves from the board would be viewed not as administrative decisions, but as escalation. No dialogue had worked. No policy had been honored. The next steps would no longer involve warnings or letters. The response would match the level of disregard they had demonstrated precise. The platform, the legal backing, and the community's attention made that gamble a losing hand. The background on Kyle Denning confirmed the suspicion that his motivations were not rooted in policy. Following a disciplinary action by the state licensing board, the violations cited deliberate misrepresentation of zoning designations and failure to disclose during which time he relocated to this community. Upon moving in, he joined the HOA as a volunteer in the Architectural Review Committee. Within 4 months, he was nominated to the board after the previous vice president resigned. Meeting records indicated that Kyle immediately introduced proposals to revise community appearance standards, enforce stricter penalties, and grant the board enforcement privileges without the need for resident voting in most circumstances. Using the new policies, Kyle established multiple subcommittees, assigning roles to residents who had not been confirmed by vote, approve or reject construction permits, and coordinate property surveillance. All approvals were centralized through the new HOA office, the same structure built without recorded permits or formal lease. Financial records revealed that Kyle oversaw the reallocation of $32,000 from the community reserve fund to beautification initiatives. A portion of this fund went into landscaping contracts issued to a company where his brother was listed as co-owner. At the same time, Kyle directed the removal of longtime volunteers from the compliance committee, issue citations to homes that had previously been cleared. When she refused, Kyle had routinely referred to long-term ranch owners as non-compliant legacy types and had forwarded internal communications, suggesting strategies to encourage turnover among original property owners. One email proposed reclassifying livestock areas as temporary agricultural zones. Both violations were internally reviewed and dismissed without formal documentation. The Architectural Review Subcommittee was instructed not to record the incidents in official violation logs in recorded meetings. Kyle advocated for uniformity in fencing styles, house color palettes, and vehicle visibility limits. He stated that community property values could increase by eliminating visual inconsistency. Surveillance procedures were introduced during Kyle's term. New mobile patrols were authorized under the guise of safety, but internal notes indicated their primary function was to identify recurring violations and track unapproved guests. GPS data from HOA patrols showed repeated monitoring of only specific properties, mostly belonging to older residents or those not participating in HOA events. During one board meeting, Kyle dismissed a resident's request for a variance by stating that exceptions opened the door to precedent. Even though board members had issued 5 exceptions in the last 3 months, all to residents affiliated with HOA leadership, the inconsistencies in policy enforcement were never addressed publicly. The legal advisory firm representing the HOA had previously worked with Kyle's real estate company in Arizona. The engagement was not disclosed during contract approval. The board approved the same firm to draft revisions to the community charter, which expanded enforcement powers and removed prior resident voting rights on several structural decisions. The revisions were presented as legal alignment, not discretionary expansion. Audio from a resident-recorded meeting included a statement from Kyle where he referenced clearing the old guard mindset and building a market-oriented culture. He described long-term residents as barriers to forward motion and stated that strategic enforcement could reset the tone. That recording was later distributed among residents and was cited in several. Board issued a public note acknowledging receipt of complaints and stating that community governance organizations are expected to operate with transparency and fairness in accordance with their own bylaws. Efforts to initiate a recall vote were blocked. Kyle had inserted a clause requiring 40% quorum for vote eligibility and 75% approval for removal. Residents opposing the changes were informed that the new thresholds were now legally binding and retroactive. Kyle's influence extended into community social events. Residents not attending events organized by the HOA leadership were labeled inactive participants, a status that limited their access to neighborhood resources such as meeting rooms and shared equipment. The board justified the restrictions as incentives for involvement. When local property listings began referencing highly managed community standards and exclusive member privileges, it became evident that the HOA, under Kyle's leadership, was working in parallel with external realtors to shift the demographic makeup of the neighborhood. The goal was to replace independent ranchers and longtime homeowners with short-term investors and high-margin buyers who viewed HOA enforcement as a value add. The impact of these coordinated actions was measurable. In 2 years, 12 original homeowners had sold their properties, 9 of them following repeated violations or formal disputes. The homes were purchased mostly by LLCs or investors with direct links to urban development firms. All new listings were rebranded as ranch-style estates instead of working ranches. Kyle's strategy was to suppress resistance through bureaucracy, isolate dissenters using policy manipulation, and execute demographic transformation under the banner of modernization. The HOA had become a tool for controlled turnover, and Kyle was the architect behind every procedural barrier. Exposure was the only countermeasure left. The documentation, financial tracing, policy comparisons, and resident testimonials were compiled into a full timeline. The project was handed to an independent oversight nonprofit for review. They categorized the case as coordinated displacement under procedural abuse and submitted a summary report to 3 local news affiliates. Kyle's restructuring of power, the fabricated standards, and the manufactured culture of compliance, all of it, pointed to a strategy rooted in removal, not governance. The next move would no longer be documentation. It would be action. The equipment was scheduled 2 weeks in advance. The contractor operated under a private hauling license with no local affiliations and no logo on the vehicle. The machine selected was a mid-size loader equipped with transport chains and a reinforced flatbed trailer. The route was mapped using satellite overlays and terrain data to avoid HOA-monitored entry points. A time window was selected based on average patrol frequency and known blind spots in the surveillance system. All critical structures within the HOA office had been previously assessed for mobility. The foundation was not permanent. The building used pre-poured slab segments not connected to an anchored footing, and plumbing access was routed through a shared utility trench that crossed the boundary line. Disconnection would require no permits under current local guidelines, provided no public utility systems were affected. 2 hours before mobilization, notices were delivered to 4 neighboring properties advising of short-term equipment, noise. No identifying source was listed. The notices cited general land maintenance and included a temporary contact number redirected to voicemail. The voicemail stated the project would be completed the same Day surveillance was deployed in the form of concealed trail cameras installed, facing all sides of the office structure and the adjacent perimeter. Backup battery packs ensured 6 hours of continuous coverage with automatic timestamping. All footage would be synchronized post-operation for verification. At 5:42, the loader entered the property through a secondary access gate maintained since the original fencing phase. No visual contact occurred with any patrol vehicles or passing traffic. The machine was guided to the rear of the HOA building. The transport chains were deployed. 3 foundation anchor points were identified and severed using rotary cutters. The disconnection process required 26 minutes. Electrical supply to the building was inactive at the time of operation. Verification was completed using a non-contact voltage tester. All detached wiring was capped and labeled with hazard tags. The water line was isolated using the primary shutoff located at the adjacent utility box. The pipe was sealed with compression fittings. Wastewater output was a closed system and had not been connected to a sewer line. The temporary holding tank was emptied the previous day by a third-party septic service. At 6:18, the building was secured with dual chains, lifted at 4 points using spreader bars, and placed onto the transport trailer. Stabilizers were deployed to prevent structure flex. Interior contents remained intact and were secured with padded bracing. No damage to the structure occurred during lift or relocation. The route led north, bypassing all HOA residential clusters. The final destination was a wooded tract located 0.8 miles beyond the marked boundary of the community. The tract was designated as Private 2's undeveloped land. A staging area had been cleared in advance with temporary leveling. The building was lowered and placed on wooden cribbing, aligned perpendicular to the access trail. No signs, logos, or markings were removed from the structure. The office door remained locked. A laminated document was affixed to the exterior wall using industrial adhesive. The document included the property deed, parcel coordinates, construction permit, void summary, and an itemized list of all violations committed by the HOA board. The final line of the document stated the following: unauthorized occupation of private land has been corrected. Future access is no longer permitted. By 7:12, the equipment was removed from the site. Tire tracks were brushed over using branch brooms. The original HOA office location was left vacant. Remaining debris was minimal and consisted of severed rebar and loose gravel. No additional structures were impacted. At 8:26, the HOA office email auto-reply was activated. The message stated, "Due to an unexpected relocation, the HOA office will be temporarily offline. Please allow 3 to 5 business days for processing delays." No further explanation was provided. Multiple residents reported the absence of the structure by midday. Photos circulated through private community forums. Theories ranged from legal seizure to vandalism. No official message from the board was issued for 48 hours. During that window, the document affixed to the relocated building was posted online by a local resident who discovered the structure while walking their dog through the Northern Trail system. The photo of the document was shared across several community groups and picked up by 2 regional housing news blogs. The articles confirmed the building had been placed outside HOA jurisdiction, and the deed listed in the document matched official. County records showing ownership under the original land parcel. Property law experts, quoted in the article, stated the act constituted lawful repossession. The structure had been constructed without a land use agreement and was subject to removal at any time by the landowner. The news cycle escalated. A third article was published outlining the sequence of HOA infractions leading up to the incident. Citations against long-term residents were detailed. The pattern of selective enforcement, the residency targeting, and the board's undisclosed relationships with contractors were exposed. A digital copy of the notarized deed was linked in the article for public review. The HOA leadership issued a joint statement. The document denied any wrongdoing, referred to the removal as property tampering, and stated that legal counsel was reviewing options. No mention was made of the deed, the lack of permits, or the original boundary error. The statement failed to address the core issue and ownership. Residents began demanding clarity. A meeting was called by petition. The board attempted to postpone, but was overridden by quorum. During the meeting, residents presented copies of the published articles, and requested an independent audit of all past violations and expenditures. A vote was taken to suspend all enforcement actions pending review. The motion passed by 78%. Requests were made for Kyle Denning to step down as president. He declined. However, under mounting pressure, 3 board members resigned within 1 week. Replacement elections were scheduled. The petition for full structural audit of HOA operations reached the required threshold for implementation. Relocated office remained untouched. The laminated document was never removed. A security camera was installed facing the front entrance of the structure with a solar battery system. A live stream link was distributed anonymously across community message boards. The video feed displayed the office, still standing, untouched in the woods. Viewership peaked at over 12,000 across various platforms. All further communications from the HOA required dual sign-off from remaining board members. Kyle's authority was restricted to administrative tasks only. His access to enforcement databases was revoked. HOA patrols were suspended indefinitely. The HOA's legal fund was frozen, pending financial review. The office had been moved. The documents had been made public. The silence had been broken. The next phase would not be recovery. It would be restructuring. The interim audit team was formed with 3 neutral residents, 2 independent reviewers recommended by the County Housing Mediation Group, and 1 licensed community management advisor. Access was granted to all archived violation records, financial reports, subcommittee decisions, and communication logs dating back 3 fiscal years. The first audit pass revealed that 67% of all citations issued in the past year were directed at only 14% of property owners. Cross-matching these citations against participation records showed that most recipients had not attended HOA organized events or had previously voted against recent charter amendments. Out of 316 total citations, 98 were issued under appearance standards that had never been formally approved through a resident vote. These standards were adopted via internal memorandum issued by Kyle Denning and marked effective immediately. No recorded board, labeled under community improvement projects. Receipts attached to these expenses were either missing or submitted as unverified estimates. A large portion of these funds had been routed through a limited liability company operated by an individual listed as a family associate of Kyle Denning. In 3 separate line items, funds designated for road maintenance had been redirected to landscaping upgrades for the homes of 2 current and 1 former board member. Drone footage confirmed recent high-cost improvements to their private driveways, irrigation lines, and fencing, none of which were on the community's maintenance priority list. The audit also identified $12,500 paid to a consultancy firm for policy harmonization. Patrol expenditures were cross-examined with logbooks submitted by contracted personnel. The GPS tracking data revealed that nearly 70% of patrol time was spent near properties of dissenting residents. Properties affiliated with board members showed no recorded patrols over a 6-month period. A review of citation appeals found that no appeal had ever been approved during the Internal Appeals Committee had been disbanded without resident. A survey was distributed anonymously to all residents regarding HOA practices, leadership trust, and procedural transparency. Participation exceeded 80%. Results showed 92% of respondents believed the HOA had applied its rules unequally. 77% reported experiencing or witnessing intimidation in the form of threats, fines, or unannounced inspections. A formal request was submitted by the advisory group to amend the community charter. The proposed changes included reinstating the appeals committee, requiring majority resident votes for any enforcement amendments, mandating public disclosure of vendor relationships, and capping board member terms to 2 years. The vote on these amendments passed with a 91% majority. Implementation was scheduled immediately. The new charter eliminated any policy enacted without proper ratification and nullified all. This wiped out 212 active fines, including all penalties issued to residents involved. In the original complaint wave, Kyle Denning refused to acknowledge the new charter in an internal memo. The board overruled his objections by majority decision and stripped him of his final voting privileges. His personal property was reclassified as non-compliant based on 2 previously suppressed complaints. was a retired legal advisor who had specialized in housing policy for 35 years. The vice chairperson was one of the residents whose property had been patrolled over 40 times in a year. The new leadership implemented a public tracking portal where all citations, appeals, budgets, and contracts would be published in real time. Anonymous resident reporting was made available to monitor future board conduct. The patrol program was disbanded permanently. Clauses, vendor contracts previously signed under Kyle's term, were frozen, pending investigation. Any vendor tied to a board member by direct or familial association was blacklisted for future bidding processes. All future contracts required 3 competitive bids and full resident disclosure prior to approval. The relocated office remained confirmed that no documentation could establish the original office had ever been legally placed. The materials within the structure were boxed and returned to the board's custody by neutral courier. The landowner refused compensation. The incident itself was archived as a precedent in the HOA's official records. A special addendum was created for the charter titled Procedural Failure and Ownership Abuse Review, issued formal apologies. In 5 cases, financial reimbursements were processed through the HOA's insurance policy under civil misconduct claims. Impacted families. The neighborhood's external profile was changed. Marketing language in real estate listings was rewritten to reflect a resident-controlled community with fully transparent governance. Pulled by community vote, local news outlets followed up with a 3-part series, documenting the full scope of the HOA restructuring. The features included interviews with former board members, affected residents, and oversight professionals. The story became a reference point for other communities undergoing similar conflicts. Kyle Denning was later removed from his temporary consulting role in another development after background checks revealed the HOA report. No civil or criminal charges were filed, but the HOA's Legal Review Committee issued a permanent block on any future board eligibility for him. The community stabilized under the new leadership. No new violations were issued in the first 90 days. Resident meetings were held in open forums, and agendas were distributed in advance. With public comment sections formally integrated into all decisions, the restructuring was complete. Authority had been dismantled, power had been rebalanced. Accountability. With the new charter amendments in place, the first quarterly review focused on assessing long-term risk and implementing structural safeguards to prevent future abuse. A compliance integrity team was established, composed of 5 elected residents with rotating terms. This team held the authority to investigate board conduct, review enforcement records, and suspend actions that appeared retaliatory or procedurally invalid. All HOA member correspondence was rerouted through a centralized digital system with timestamps, automated archiving, and read receipt logging. Each interaction between board members and residents became part of a permanent, searchable record. Community-wide training sessions were introduced. These sessions educated residents on bylaw navigation, appeals procedures, and financial oversight. Participation was optional but highly attended. For residents who could not attend live, the financial oversight system was fully digitized. All budget allocations were posted monthly with itemized reports from the board and one from the Financial Oversight Subcommittee. Emergency spending protocols were added to prevent discretionary fund misuse under the guise of urgency. Land use and architectural requests were moved to a public application model. Residents could view all pending requests, submit input within a 5-day window, and track the approval status of any submission. Previously, such decisions were handled privately and finalized without community awareness. The new system introduced full process visibility. The HOA's documentation policy was rewritten. All future rule changes required a 30-day review period, with digital and printed notices distributed to every property. No vote could be held without confirmation of delivery receipts. Proxy votes were tracked and verified by the compliance team, preventing concentration of power through manipulated absentee voting. To resolve past damages, a restorative initiative was launched. Property owners who had sold under pressure were contacted with the option to submit grievance statements. Refunds were processed based on documentation, and families received formal letters acknowledging policy failure and written approval from both the compliance team and the resident. Unauthorized inspections would result in board disciplinary action. All previous inspection records were reviewed. 39% were found to have been conducted without proper notice or justification. The board issued public apologies to all impacted parties and invited those still residing in the community to participate in review forums. Many accepted. These forums produced policy revisions, including the elimination of vague citations like unneighborly aesthetics, visual disharmony, and suspicious occupancy, which were identified as the most frequently abused enforcement terms to prevent future zoning misuse. A partnership was formed with the County Records Office. All property boundary data was updated using GIS mapping. The HOA agreed to submit to third-party verification before initiating any construction or enforcement tied to land use. This agreement was entered into public record for long-term memory and protection. The HOA established a digital public archive. It included all previous versions of the community charter, enforcement logs, board rosters, financial summaries, and conflict resolutions. The incident involving the unauthorized HOA office construction and removal was documented as Case 001. The case file included full audit results, board decisions, and related media coverage. A cultural shift also followed. Community events were no longer organized by board leadership alone. Instead, a resident activities committee was formed, open to all households. Events were proposed and voted on collectively, with budget allocations approved in open sessions. This reduced the influence of leadership cliques and increased participation across formerly isolated groups. The architectural design standards were revisited. The committee compared each rule to original development intents and local zoning. Laws, outdated or aesthetic-only restrictions, were struck down. Residents gained broader autonomy over landscaping, fencing, exterior design, and utility upgrades. These changes restored the rural functionality many homeowners had originally intended. A legacy policy was added to the charter. This ensured that no future leadership could revoke the original landowner status protections that were neglected under the prior board. This clause gave founding owners extended development rights and immunity from policies enacted after their initial tenure. Unless changes were adopted by supermajority vote, public trust began to rebuild. Engagement with meetings tripled. Residents, previously uninvolved, began volunteering for committees. Survey participation remained high, and community-wide satisfaction ratings climbed to 86% within 3 months of implementation. Former board members who had participated in coercive enforcement were prohibited from holding future leadership positions. This clause was retroactively included in the revised eligibility standards and required all board candidates to disclose past disciplinary actions or conflicts of interest. Vendor selection underwent a complete transformation. A pre-approved contractor list was created based on transparent pricing, ethical history, and performance reviews. Contractors with ties to Kyle Denning or any board member were removed. All future contracts now included strict termination clauses for undisclosed relationships or fraudulent billing. To prevent real estate manipulation, a new policy barred HOA members from holding financial interests in properties listed for resale. Within the community, a conflict of interest register was introduced, and violations triggered immediate removal from leadership roles. Communication was modernized. All official notices were distributed via a verified platform. Anonymous tip lines were introduced, empowering residents to report misconduct or emerging bias before it escalated. This helped prevent abuses of power in real time. A rolling 3-year review schedule was implemented, covering every policy, vendor agreement, and enforcement process. This system of continuous accountability prevented outdated or corrupt practices from becoming permanent. Within months, the HOA became a regional case study. Governance forums invited board members to share their reform model, and housing policy researchers cited the turnaround as a prime example of combating systemic abuse in self-managed communities. In just 6 months, enforcement abuse disappeared. Violations dropped by 83%. And nearly half of all appeals now favored residents, an enormous shift from the rubber-stamped denials of the past. Kyle Denning's era was over. What followed wasn't just recovery, it was institutional resilience. The Compliance Integrity Team released its first annual report. The numbers were clear. Contested violations had dropped 94%, and every appeal filed under the new system had been resolved each within an average of 6.4 days, down from the previous 41.2. All cases were publicly documented, including resident responses and signed decisions. The HOA's revised charter sparked changes beyond its own borders. County officials requested a formal briefing, leading to a memorandum of understanding that created a direct line between the HOA and county oversight. This closed legal gaps that had once allowed private associations to operate without accountability. Other ICS took notice. 8 neighboring communities adopted key parts of the system after a public template repository was launched, featuring modular enforcement language, digital communication protocols, and compliance tracking tools. The first leadership election under the new term limit rules was a landmark moment. Candidates had to disclose vendor ties, outline their platforms, and undergo public Q&A sessions. Voting used secure, double verification digital ballots, and mirrored paper backups. Turnout hit 89%, a record. Candidates who failed to disclose conflicts or submit full documentation were disqualified. Public debates were held, and every question from ethics to transparency was archived. Trust in the process surged. The new board enhanced transparency even further. Budgets were released 30 days ahead of votes for community feedback. Surpluses were monitored against reserves, and investment decisions required resident approval. Board pay and reimbursements were made viewable in real-time dashboards, with risky enforcement practices gone. The HOA's insurance provider lowered premiums by 14%. The savings were redirected toward broadband expansion and infrastructure repairs. The defunct HOA patrol program was officially dissolved. Vehicles and surveillance equipment were auctioned, and the proceeds funded a general resident benefit pool. Residents voted quarterly on how to spend the money. Proposals ranged from school grants to agricultural co-op funding. A formal grievance protocol was enacted. Residents could now file complaints directly to the compliance integrity team, triggering document preservation and a mandatory internal review within 72 hours. Involved board members were barred from participating in investigations. 3 complaints were filed in the first year. All led to corrective actions. 1 board member was reprimanded for an undisclosed contractor tie. Another was temporarily suspended for dismissive conduct, and a third completed anti-bias training. Education also became a cornerstone of the new culture. All new residents were required to complete an onboarding program covering rights, charter rules, enforcement limits, and how to file complaints. The program was available via video, PDF, and live sessions to ensure accessibility and consistency. Annual community surveys expanded to 40 areas, including leadership trust, communication quality, and service access. Results were overwhelmingly positive: 93% satisfaction with governance, 91% trust in leadership, and a staggering 98% approval of the compliance system. The land where the new HOA office stood was registered as a civic learning site. A nonprofit helped install a historical marker detailing the community's governance, crisis, and recovery. A QR code linked visitors to the full digital archive and timeline of reforms. The homeowner who had once been targeted by the HOA for enforcement abuse kept the building. He transformed it into a free legal resource center run by volunteers. On weekends, the original violation notice was left untouched. Now encased in protective glacis, permanent reminder of what was and what was overcome. Legislative interest followed. A state-level housing policy subcommittee referenced the case in a session about HOA transparency law reform. Testimonies were provided by affected residents, including documentation of procedural abuse, intimidation patterns, and financial exploitation. The subcommittee drafted a bill requiring private HOAs to disclose policy changes, vendor relationships, and conflict resolution data to county officials annually. The bill passed in preliminary stages. A pilot program was established in 3 counties. The reforms from this HOA became the framework for digital reporting tools and vendor transparency registries. The state acknowledged the community's contribution in a formal statement read into the record by year 2. Property values in the community stabilized and gradually increased, not due to restrictive aesthetics, but improved livability, restored confidence, and proven governance reliability. Turnover slowed. Families that had considered leaving during the Kyle Denning period reversed course. Several returned to participate in committees or advise on future safeguards. The role of the original conflict remained central in all planning documents. No reference was sanitized. The incident was acknowledged in every board orientation session, every governance training, and every future charter amendment discussion. Board members were required to study the full audit findings as a condition of service. A new oath was added, acknowledgement of past abuses, and commitment to prevent recurrence. Each signed oath was archived and publicly posted. All disciplinary processes were structured with zero tolerance for retaliation. Retaliation was defined clearly, enforceable immediately, and punishable by permanent removal from leadership and loss of voting rights. Resident engagement platforms expanded. A dedicated transparency hub allowed anyone to track issue status, submit anonymous feedback, and request review of any board action. No leadership role could be held for more than one term without a community-wide exemption vote. Succession planning was enforced to prevent internal consolidation of power. Every enforcement rule carried a built-in expiration clause, requiring re-ratification after 2 years or automatic sunset. This eliminated dormant rules used strategically against residents. The conflict had ended not with litigation, but with architecture, policy, process, and culture. Every mistake became a clause. Every abuse became a checkpoint. Every silence became a lesson. Sustainability was secured not through trust, but through systems designed to make trust unnecessary. The final phase focused on knowledge transfer, future-proofing, and external support integration. The HOA formally partnered with a housing justice network to distribute governance reform kits modeled on their rebuilt charter. These kits included procedural templates, audit checklists, conflict reporting, flowcharts, and enforcement analysis tools. Within 6 months, over 300 organizations had downloaded the material. A volunteer-run advisory council was created, composed of current and former residents, community governance professionals, and legal policy analysts. This group provided consultation to other HOAs, encountering early signs of power, centralization, or resident targeting behavior. The council maintained a backlog-free response protocol, resolving most inquiries within 10 days. A multi-tiered performance audit schedule was institutionalized. Every operational area enforcement, finances, elections, complaints, and communications and review on staggered cycles. Each audit required third-party verification. Findings were submitted to the resident body in summary, reports with mandatory follow-up recommendations, and implementation timelines. Community land records were integrated into a digital parcel management system. All boundary data, ownership history, and improvement permits were available to residents in real time. This transparency prevented future land misidentification, as occurred with the original HOA office location. Every new structure or modification was logged before physical work began. A standing review committee was formed with rotating members. Selected by lottery from the resident pool, the committee had limited terms, reviewed all proposed charter changes, and held veto authority if a proposed amendment failed to meet procedural integrity standards. Any override required a 2/3 supermajority vote. Vendor relations transitioned into public contract lifecycle management. Bidding processes, evaluation rubrics, contract performance metrics, and contractor evaluations were fully digitized. Residents could view contractor histories, dispute logs, and termination clauses. This ended unvetted personal contracting relationships and ensured fairness in vendor selection. Education remained foundational. The community launched an annual Civic Integrity Week, inviting speakers, hosting workshops, and offering scenario-based training simulations for residents. Sessions included ethics in self-governance, enforcement restraint, budget transparency, and anti-retaliation design. Attendance increased each year with outside communities sending observers. A digital dashboard displayed current board motions, vote breakdowns, budget allocations, open complaints, and policy review cycles. Residents could subscribe to updates, filter by category, and leave feedback. All board decisions were time-stamped, attributed, and open to challenge through the standard dispute system. A system-wide redundancy plan ensured operational continuity if the board faced mass resignation, emergency suspension, or procedural gridlock. The plan included succession sequencing, emergency committee triggers, and temporary service protocols, removing single-point dependency and leadership bottlenecks. Every former procedural failure became a permanent flag in the policy review database. If a new rule mirrored the language or structure of a previously abused policy, the system flagged it for mandatory review. This protected against cyclical abuse through cosmetic rewarding. Property transfers now included an HOA governance disclosure package. Every new buyer received a digital packet containing the charter, enforcement history, appeal rights, and governance values. The package was also filed with the county, ensuring long-term buyers and investors understood the governance environment. Legacy protections for long-term residents were recalibrated. Rather than offering blanket exemptions, a structured accommodation system was introduced. Residents could apply for exceptions under specific categories. Historic use, disability, agricultural operations, and appeals were evaluated by a neutral board that had no enforcement authority. This preserved rights without shielding misuse. An HOA executive summary was submitted annually to a stake-level community governance clearinghouse. This non-binding submission demonstrated voluntary compliance with emerging best practices and allowed early identification of policy drift risk indicators, or resident-reported irregularities. Leadership training became mandatory. All new board members completed a certified training module focused on conflict prevention, BIA's mitigation, financial stewardship, procedural law, and trauma-informed enforcement. Completion was required before voting privileges were activated. Refusal resulted in disqualification. Dispute mediation protocols were aligned with community expectations. Residents could request facilitated resolution through licensed mediators. Before formal complaints escalated, the board had no access to confidential mediation transcripts, ensuring neutral outcomes and reducing adversarial proceedings. Emergency governance powers were limited by scope and time. Any declared emergency had to be ratified by resident vote within 72 hours, and any temporary rule enacted under emergency conditions automatically expired after 30 days, unless reapproved through standard processes. Annual community satisfaction metrics were compared year over year. Trends were tracked across equity and enforcement, participation, access, financial confidence, and leadership integrity. Areas of decline triggered review, corrective plan formulation, and open session acknowledgement of causes. The relocated HOA office structure remained operational as a nonprofit civic literacy hub. It hosted clinics on tenant rights, land use policy, and HOA law. Residents of nearby counties began requesting access to the sessions, leading to regional partnerships and co-hosted trainings. Data collection was disaggregated to track demographic equity. Enforcement, complaint resolutions, and leadership participation were monitored for signs of racial age, income, or property value bias. Early identification systems flagged any disproportionate application of rules. Reports were submitted quarterly. The community's governance system became recognized nationally. Academic researchers published 2 case studies, citing its transition from systemic abuse to procedural resilience. One report was presented at a national housing equity conference, highlighting how HOA authority, left unchecked, can erode core civic rights and how community-led design can reverse that trend. No further hostile enforcement incidents occurred. Not a single resident received a violation without documentation, rationale, and response opportunity. Community disputes were resolved faster, more fairly, and with less cost. Leadership remained diverse, representative, and term-limited. The final safeguards involved future-proofing leadership. An advisory succession council formed to mentor incoming board members, pass down procedural knowledge, and oversee oath adherence. Each departing board member conducted a public debrief, outlining policy challenges, conflict areas, and lessons learned. These were archived for new leadership orientation. The case that began with unauthorized towing, unlawful construction, and attempted property suppression ended with policy architecture that ensured recurrence would be impossible. The Systems would remain long after the names changed. Procedures, not personalities, held power. Systems, not assumptions, guaranteed fairness. The structure that once symbolized unchecked authority had been moved, documented, repurposed, and transformed into a monument of resistance, resilience, and reform. Governance was no longer about compliance, it was about dignity. And that dignity was no longer negotiable.